I have a certain need to always find music and a certain approach of how I do this that hasn't changed over the years, and that is very much tied to a physical media still, which is vinyl records. Not even just about the music, but like the aspect of going out and looking for music in the way of digging records as sort of a yoga quality for me. Like it's really a way for me to switch off my mind and come in a sort of meditative state of mind. And this has been the case for the last 25 years, I would say. And I also feel like there's a certain randomness in when you look out for records in places that are not necessarily record shops, but like thrift stores or flea markets and all this kind of stuff. And I just love this so much, and I discovered incredible amounts of music through doing it like this old school way. So this is basically just for me like how music comes into my life and stays relevant also throughout the years. The need to also go out there in the world and discover new places, looking for records, is one of the most beautiful things I find in the nerdy thing that is collecting records. But there is also, of course, a very intrinsic need for me to discover music to nourish my soul and find a vehicle to let go of emotions, especially in times that are pretty hard right now, for example, where I feel I always relegated back to music, and especially music that has a certain kind of deepness to it, a certain kind of like, whether it's lyrical or through harmonies that are just like evoking certain emotions. And and I think I always fall back to certain kind of jazz records, certain kind of soul records that they keep inspiring me, and I keep finding stuff that, just like it doesn't stop. So, yeah. Well, like let's say before marketing has become such a big force in music, that people would do things under a lot of different pseudonyms just to kind of fuck around with perception of people, and like switch aliases and to have a certain mystique, around a persona, not to be too shouty and in your face, this is me and this is, how I look like, but you really had to actually look for the information to even find something. You had to go out and look for the records to find information about the artists. And I kind of grew up in the age where this was perceived as the best thing and the coolest thing. So now I sound old, I know, but at the same time I feel there's a big intrinsic value to mystery, especially in our age of total sensory overload. Me, as a consequence of like liking so much different music as well as a record collector and DJ, I felt always kind of it would be ridiculous to just stick to one thing. I would get bored so quickly, so I change all the time with my musical projects. This year there's going to be another new thing, totally different music again, and this is just a way for me to also keep the excitement there, because I feel the day it becomes just a job, then I that's not me. Then I'd rather do something completely different. But music has a deep meaning for me. Like let's put it like this. I grew up in a time when subcultures were still very much a thing. So even by just looking at a person and the way they dress, you could say, okay, this guy's hip hop, this guy's house, this guy's punk, whatever. I grew up in a small town where this was a very sort of distinct thing. You only had a couple of cultures. So hip hop was very prevalent, and then rock music was very prevalent. Already dance was kind of totally very, very little. And even as a kid, I was kind of, in a way, frustrated, and also I wanted to cross the borders and cross the rules of like, okay, you dress a certain way, you behave a certain way, you do certain things, you are part of that subculture. But at the same time, I wanted to understand why do these subcultures, where do they come from, and what was the story of it, So I got really deep into first jazz, then hip hop, then house music, and again, the big part of it was actually go out and finding records. And back then, where I grew up, you didn't really have information on the internet. You really had to go to actual physical shops, where there were very few in the area where I grew up. And then what happens is you would have to find other people who are into this music, and then in this way you kind of create your own subculture. And even though this is just because I'm a kid that was brought up in the 90s, you know, like I still have that such a big integral part of me, and I was incredibly young to do it. Yeah, I was like 10 years old when I started actually being interested in hip hop and house and all of that. But it's still, I nourish from it to this day, and I still feel not being judgy, you know, it's things have shifted and you can't take them back. But that's who I am, and I would rather keep on doing it this way and feel good about it, and also say what was maybe good about it, instead of just being like, oh, but today this is bad, and no. But that's just who I am. It's not only music, but of course it's art in general that I nourish from. So if it's a moment where I feel like I'm touring a lot and I feel kind of overwhelmed by just too much, you know, gigs or whatever and traveling and so, I take a book, or I watch a movie or something, and this way I can get inspiration from a different kind of part. But in general, I would just say that culture and also traveling and seeing different cultures on this beautiful planet is a big part of what nourishes me and keeps me excited about still doing it after all these years. You know, I'm seeing also how big of an impact culture in general has on this planet, and how we can change things for the better through culture, through music, through art, and especially in our current times, you know, where I feel artists are the first ones who will be suffering if, you know, we are drifting more and more towards fascism and all of that. So I think it's super important to fight for our art, you know, and to fight as an artist these days. You know. So there's this label Space Grapes that was basically growing out of the frustration of me just always sampling music, and you know, I love a certain, also with the records that inspired me, I loved a certain patina, a certain kind of way how things sounded just old and a little maybe dirty, if you want to call it like that. Like I grew up with 90s hip hop, so, you know, Tribe Called Quest, Gang Starr, you know, Pete Rock, Seal Smooth, later on Madlib and these kind of people, JD of course, you know, and there was a certain kind of roughness and a certain kind of attitude to how they treated samples that I also later on found in house music then, and this kind of rawness basically comes from how the artists that they sampled recorded back in the 70s, 60s, 80s, and for me I wanted to achieve that kind of sound in the studio again. So I wanted to be able to just basically recreate, or not necessarily like just to be retro, but like just to have the same kind of sonority. I'm not talking about like a creative rip-off or whatever, but it's more about like, how can I make my snare drum sound the way that it sounded in the 60s or 70s, you know? So it's which microphone, which compressor, do you record it to digital or tape or no, all these kind of things. And I took a deep dive into this subject, and so it's really beautiful to have a new journey and a new adventure that is very different from how I previously did music when I sampled a lot. But at the same time, it seems like a continuation, because the actual patina of the sound, you know, the way how things sound like they are sampled, that's something that is like a lineage of Motor City Drum Ensemble or Inverse Cinematics before that, you know. So it's for me, it's a continuous red line, you know. Okay, so back to English. Like I've been working more on remixes and stuff lately. There was just a moment where I was a little bit, yeah, like you say, how do you get excited again? How do you get nourished? So I was a little bit, for the last 10 years already, a little bit less excited about doing house music in the studio myself, and now it's kind of coming back a little bit more, and it's a different kind of way of how I go at things right now, and we will see what happens with this. But I could tell some more, but I'm not at liberty yet. But things are gonna happen, I guess, this year. Yeah, it's very cliche, of course. But if you have, and I think I would probably go insane at some point if I only had the one record and I'm on a desert island and you know, there's nobody. I'm like sitting there chanting this one mantra. But at the same time, If it had to be that, then John Coltrane, Love Supreme, in a meditative state where you can maybe reach a higher state of consciousness, then that would be a beautiful way to go out, yeah. But still, I can't, like, even as a record collector, I have probably, I don't know, like 25,000 easy records. And even to narrow this down to 100 is already, like, it's very, very tough, you know. But like I say, what I love about the idea, if you really had to bring it down to one record and you're on a desert island, I don't know if it's by myself or whatnot, but then you want something that kind of lets you more cope with the situation that you are there and you only have this one record. So then why not have it be something that is a mantra in itself? And John Coltrane's Love Supreme is basically a chant, a prayer, you know. So, and it's a wonderful record that has guided me through very rough patches of my life, and has a really deep meaning to me. Like, you know, with my old label partner Pablo Valentino, we used to joke about if we had a country, we would call it Coltrania. You know, we would like sort of have rules about in school you would have like 1 hour per week of John Coltrane. You know, so it's a little crazy maybe, but yeah. I think, of course, it's becoming harder and harder to find records on the cheap, but at the same time, there is still crazy stuff out there. You just really have to take time, which I know, of course, is an extreme luxury in this incredibly fast world that we live in. And I also, like, if you are a young DJ and you're aspiring, you know, it's not about having the rarest records, it's not about having the most expensive records, it's not about having many records, but like with 10 euros in the right secondhand shop, you can find 10 good records or like 5, and then just find ways to play them as much as possible and learn them inside out. When I started out, I didn't have access to a lot of record shops. There was one little shop in the town I grew up in, and then all the rest I had to travel. I was too young to have a car, so it was not easy, and I only had a couple of records, but I would play them so much that I would know them inside out. Within a very limited set of options, still be able to find your own language. I think that's what actually makes a DJ, you know, like if you're able to, like I always say, like a funny experiment, if I would do like a sort of interview thing for Instagram or whatever, which I already don't like, but whatever, my concept would be go to a random thrift shop, give somebody 20 euros, give them 15 minutes time, and you buy whatever you can find, and then they play a little set with what you got. And then you can see like how much of a broad general knowledge of music people actually have, you know, or if it's like really just, this is my tiny little bubble of field where I feel comfortable in, and I have no problem with that. But I think as a DJ in general, you should still be able to kind of do that, you know, and appreciate music to a level where even with very little means and even in random shops, you can still find something that represents you. Yeah, I don't know, what could be, for example, like lately, there's this trend, of course, of like lots of more faster, and then there's like the whole prog house and the tribal house and this kind of stuff, which at the time, in the 90s when I grew up, this was not considered very tasty, and I can see why people think that way still. But then still, I also try to find something that represents me in those kind of genres and try to incorporate it in the right context, you know. So it's a fun challenge to stay also, you know, I'm never gonna sell myself, because I can't, because I just love music too much to ever play something that I don't generally like. But it's a very nice challenge to go into territories that you think like, okay, there I really, or like say country music, or like, you know, like there must be things, and there are things, you know, if you look deep enough, there are crazy things. Lately there's stuff where I'm like, wow, this is incredible and very jazz and very sophisticated, and I hear it differently, you know, like even a Johnny Mitchell or something that as a kid I was like, I don't really see it, but now I'm like, okay, actually, yeah, it makes sense. Yeah. So.